Like there is a lot of platforms, feminist platforms that have a lot of success, and these platforms are going to be showing not only things about feminism, but about other minorities. Why? Because to be a good feminist platform, you are going to have to show awareness about other problems. Why? Because thanks to social Marxism, this is like the way to be feminist, not only center on your, but you have to support all of them. Maybe you'll keep like the majority of things that you post are about women, but at least there is contact with certain other realities. So this is like a specific and really comparative way to learn about things that maybe before I wasn't aware of. Second, because demonstration might be like might put us together, and we might put like there is a LGBTQ pride, like a day in which we do demonstrations in favor of the oppressed people, and thus we might establish relationships with people, etc., etc. Okay, also through literature, etc. A lot of people learn feminism through literature. If literature is much more intersectional and literature is raise more awareness about different topics, all of this can happen. And through all of this, we can make for people to have much more awareness, and thus they can deconstruct better their privilege, their racial or social or economic privilege that they have, and be much more aware from this. You're much more likely to, I don't know, vote for electors that will do things for them. Maybe, for example, right now in Spain, there is a law about trans people, and maybe if I am already aware of the situation, I'm much more likely to back this and legitimate this law, and it will be easier for it to pass in the parliament, etc., etc. Okay, so at the end of the day, awareness is all if we really want for people to change their conduct, not only in a big policy level, which is going to go in the second argument, but in the individual level. How is this? Because me as a person, I am much more respectful. Like, for example, if thanks to this social Marxism, I as a gay person understand that there are other minorities, such as racial people that, for example, in Spain, since the majority of the people are white, I might might not sound that much. So maybe thanks to the LGBTQ movement in Spain, acquiring this new social Marxism, I might learn a lot much more about racism. And when I face with a person that is not white, then I might change my conduct thanks to all of that I learned, and this might be better because I respect people, etc., etc. So, CO, what is your question?
Assuming that the success of the social movements, am I audible? Yeah. Assuming that the success of the social movement is contingent on people buying into this kind of narratives, and the structural barriers for each movement still exists, what is your analysis on explaining how you're going to make to policy change?
Okay, great. That comes right now. So policy change is actually, I don't think, well, let me first address on people that might be not sold on feminism, just because now feminism is defending a lot of things that I'm not supporting. Okay, first of all, if a feminist, I'm putting feminism as an example always just because I think it's a huge movement. But first, if I am a feminist, but I don't support racialist people, and because I'm really privileged, I'm not like the feminist that's going to fight most. I am just a feminist and I just say so. So I don't think that's like a feminist that's going to fight a lot, going to a lot of demonstrations and make the movement advance. So it's not like a huge loss. Second, what's going to be most likely is not that people are going to stop being feminists just because right now they have to accept people from other races. It's because they're going to keep, if they're feminists in the first place, it's because they care about women. And if now they say, no, if you're feminist, you have to support other minorities, they're going to be, okay, then I'm a bad feminist. Okay, the fact that this, if you're so racist that you're not willing to accept this, you're not going to stop caring about women. That doesn't make logical sense. It's just that you're going to be considered a bad feminist. And that's actually good. Is like, this is not enough. You should deconstruct your whole privilege. So that's actually good. Like, the person is not going to stop backing up policies in favor of women just because this the movement that is striving for them is also striving for other things. That wouldn't be logical. And how are we going to push for policies, you ask? I think that, well, in both sides of the house, we push for policies, but the thing that's comparative in government and that's really good is that policies are going to be diverse and are going to give a voice to those minorities whose social movement in a specific country might not be like wide enough for them to be heard. For example, as I said previously, in Spain, anti-ableism or racism, this is the case. So we might push for like feminism is really big here. We might push for like diversity in workforce, helping women, but thanks to the same people that have already achieved this, also pushing for other boundaries, now not only helping women, but helping people, disabled people, etc. And this is better because on opposition, it will be much harder to achieve this. So opening government. Thank you.
We thank the speaker very much, and we're happy to call on the leader of the opposition. Hear her.
Right, just checking that I'm audible. As usual, please put the PYs in the chat, blah, blah, blah. Let's quickly get into my notes. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, government clearly just doesn't recognize how social movements actually have power and status quo. They aren't just labels that float around, people don't follow because suddenly ideologies change. They are groups of people that push for certain ideals and have to garner support from different groups. Specifically, the best support they can garner is support from the people who are actually they are fighting for those who are oppressed. And those who want for an important role, they are there to enact social change, because that's how we even got social change in the first place, fighting for rights of specific individual people. Sorry, can we stop?
Yeah, let's stop. You also were kind of cutting off from me as well. Is there something you can do about that?
Maybe you all can just turn off the camera, and then if it's okay for you, I can just start over.
Yeah, I think we'll just start over, and maybe all of us turn off our cameras. Do you have a different option of connection in case?
Like I'd have a hotspot per se, but that's not going to be better. I think it's just momentarily a 1 second thing.
Okay.
So
let's try with our cameras off. So yeah, just cool. Just start from the beginning. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So what government is sadly fails to realize is that they don't recognize how social movements actually gain power and actually garner political change, namely by allying themselves with those they are fighting for and not convincing some way other people because you suddenly change the label. Then you think that I am that label. I will now follow your ideas, thinking about it. And what we think is that they should actually stay on the strategy of fighting for those who are actually most affected by the oppression they experience, and that is precisely for those that yes, at present, the marginalized that they are going to lose on their side. Quickly, let me just recap what we actually need social movements for, and that is to enact positive social change for various different groups, and these various different groups, LGBT people, women, people of different ethnicities, all the intersections of those experience different types of oppression that come from different types of reasons, from economic reasons, from reasons of stereotypization, from, of course, which can all intersect, and just a reason of just personal biases that exist for our society, perpetuating an experience in everyday life. These can't all be pushed into one thing, and there is garner specific different solutions. For example, fighting for trans healthcare means a very, very different direction to go into than you want to solve the economic problems of people who work in the coal mining industry. So specific different things that specific different groups have to push for these groups, and just pushing them all into one bowl won't necessarily lead to the solutions you want to have. Government now tries to go around this by saying we want to get as much support as we can from everyone by exposing different people to different types of ideas. But different types of ideas, learning doesn't exist in a vacuum. Just because you present someone with an idea without any context, or just saying that you have to support them because they're part of a movement now, doesn't mean they're going to do that effectively. Realistically, even if you yourself would do that in the direction where you're not specialized, then you're probably not going to do that as well as those who have been specialized in that. If you can actually draw from people who have that lived experience of feeling the type of economic oppression, of racial oppression, of oppression of any other type, that can actually then touch on the emotions of people, and that can actually manage to sway them, because rationally people know that queer people exist, people know that poor people exist, and they have problems, just have to be convinced, and for that you need emotional level. And I'll prove later on why you actually lose the people on your side, lose the information you need. Quickly, CG.
Right, explain to me why trans healthcare is not a feminist issue.
I'd say just look over to the UK and look at TERFs. I'd say a big bunch of feminists actually very much disagree that trans care is not a feminist issue. And even beyond that, feminism and trans healthcare isn't the only thing here. Was that racial oppression? Was that economic oppression? You can't just say it's all just one thing, because specific things require specific short-term solutions to be able to help people who are suffering right now in the status quo. It'd be great if we could solve everything with utopia. That's not realistic, because right now, the majority that has the power, the people who are rich, people who are white, people who have the money, these people have an invested interest in staying with status quo, and they don't necessarily see something that intrinsically wrong with it. Otherwise, people wouldn't be oppressed by definition. So, quickly, why do social movements need political capital? And then I'll prove why they need political capital that need specifically from the people who they are fighting for. They need political capital because usually they work on the ground. They aren't just social movements, they exist in a vacuum. They aren't just labels that are thrown around that you vote for. Usually social movements work by trying to dance individually, then say, okay, here's someone's getting a protest from the clinic where you can try to contact a certain politician, and by contacting a certain person, you're able to enact pressure on the person, see there are a lot of people speaking out about a certain problem, and these people, because they have an interest in being re-elected and representing their constituents, will then be more inclined to then actually enact some type of change. So you actually need a lot of people on the ground that they can convince on a like really small basis of personal issues where you can talk to people. For that, you need something really that's easily graspable. Social Marxism isn't easily graspable. Why? Because it's a very big and very complicated concept where you try to encompass all different types of oppression into one big thing. And it's way easier to say, hey, this person needs help here really specifically because of these specific reasons. That's why you should fight for them. And that's why you should come out and stand here in the protest with us in a couple of days. It's way easier than saying, hey, you have to fight here with these other 5 groups. We might be aligned with one's interest, and then you have to fight with other 4 transitively. That's just not as intuitive for an average person to be able to convince. But beyond, so yeah, now, going to the argument of why you actually then lose social political capital. The first point, which you can't be hinting at all the time, is you will lose those who then they'll just be disconnected because they don't see their own issues propagated, the ones that they actually suffer for. Why would they see that? Because they're actually seeing that whilst you're propagating them on one thing, whilst you're focusing on one thing, you're also going to all these different types of things, trying to push different types of ideas, and the actual thing that you're fighting for, a social movement, gets lost in the shuffle. And you also just don't have the full, so yeah, sorry, 1 second. They even see you allying yourself with people you might not want to be on your side. For example, if you are black and if you are trans woman, you personally sometimes just want those people to fight for you and actually be vocal and actually see that you're powerful and loud and not just have white men fill up the entire stage of the activism. So you feel like that these people aren't actually representing you, they're doing a lot of the activism here, and you feel like your own group is actually getting lost in the shuffle. That means that people who are actually oppressed will be actually driven away from these groups because they feel like they aren't being represented anymore, and then you actually lose the information of those who are actually being oppressed, and you lose those who are affected most, and thus those who could be the loudest and most vocal when trying to convince others and trying to go on the street and try to connect with them with their own emotional story. You also lose general support because you're going to lose, just again, as I said before, the general human reaction. I'll take OG, sorry.
Yes, this doesn't mean that I'm going to, as a gay person, support all of the things at the same time. That means that when Black Lives Matter movements, I feel like a responsibility to also be part of it because I have to have empathy with them because I'm also oppressed. That is what it means.
Oh, like that sounds nice, but realistically, you won't just say, most people know that people suffer bad lives if they aren't in the normal, like, to inform to default. The thing is, you have to somehow emotionally connect to that specific experience. You should care for other people now because we say so isn't going to crack it. You actually really need a very specific emotional connection. It only comes from when you're fighting for specific things where you have to get specific goals. And if you fight for everything all the time for everyone, you're not getting that solution. But even if you do, the types of solutions you're going to get to are going to be massively compromised. Why? Because you're fighting for lots of other groups by definition. You're fighting for everyone at the same time and have to come to an agreement with everyone at the same time if everyone wants to do that consistently. And we know how much, especially leftist social movements, love infighting. They're probably not going to be able to get to a really efficient conclusion at the end of the day here. So probably it is very likely that the types of conclusions you're able to get, the types of messaging you're able to get, you can all agree upon, is going to be massively, massively hindered. Furthermore, again, if the different types of groups are maybe quite well as verbalizing what types of oppression other people experience because they don't have the same lived experience, so they might say things not with the right words, might not speak for the people correctly that those actually want to be spoken for, and thus, again, might drive other people away, but also just might not do the messaging as effectively and does not garner the same amount of effective capital. So, and also just in general, change that works incrementally. You probably aren't going to be able to achieve the massive social change that social Marxism would entail to be able to get rid of oppression for everyone at the same time. At the end of the day, it's way better to be able to focus on specific individual issues. These specific individual issues are better pushable if you actually focus on the oppression of specific individual groups, which is the alternative we propose here, and not for the general oppression of everyone. Just focus on every social movement, focus on their singular oppression, and can, of course, tactically decide to work with one another if the oppression intersects 100%, but that won't happen all at the same time. So, in summary, government loses those most hardened, they will no longer follow the social active movements. That will be an emotional harm for them. You lose this greater in general because you aren't able to do the emotional stories, and you probably won't be able to get greater results, and thus proud to oppose.
Okay, we thank the speaker very much, and very happy to call on the Deputy Prime Minister if you're here.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are now not audible. Okay, now you are.
Am I or am I not?
You are.
Perfect. Okay. So just put my chrono, whatever it's called. Okay. Sorry for my accent before starting, because I have a really horrible accent. And please be wise in the chat, not verbally. Okay, so there we go. Coordination not only is important in resources and funds and visibility, but also in timings and agenda setting. I want to really get deeper in this point because it's really going to make a clash.
You cut off.
Do you hear me?
I think it's a microphone problem.
Yeah, something
It's
wrong
like-
with the microphone. I think it's just disconnected, perhaps.
It should work now, maybe?
What?
I think we can give them their voice is just good faint, so maybe they could try that.
Let them do their thing. I'm sure they
Can you
have a
hear me
handle on that.
here?
Yes.
Because you can switch here.
Okay, so that sounds really good. So perhaps it's a good idea.
Great, thank you.
Pásame el agua, por favor.
Yeah, you're audible.
Perfect, thanks. Just 1 second, I have to reset on my headphones.
Start over. That's okay.
It's over here. This goes here and here. Perfect. Sorry, I'm really sorry. So as I was saying that please be wise through the chat. I'm sorry for my accent. I have a really horrible accent, but I hope that you can understand me. Further than that, I'll start. I'll put my time in. There we go. Coordination is not only important in resources, funds, and visibility, but also in timings and agenda setting. I really want to get deeper in this point because it's going to clash pretty well with opening opposition case. Not only is that me as a rich and influential gay, for example, imagine where I'm not, whatever, will support also the anti-ableism movement or the minoritarian social claims that has almost no visibility in the regions, but is such as, I don't know, for example, racialized population in certain regimes that they have much less visibility and funds and resources because of their context. And I can help them because they are going to be part of my fights. But it's also that we'll be able to cooperate and coordinate around demonstration timings about important topics to claim and so on and so on. And I explain myself in this point. Nowadays, agenda setting is crucial to our social fights. Newspapers, TV, social media, and so on work in a one hot topic method. What does it mean? That trending topics and hot topics in media are the biggest way to impact society and have visibility. We focus as a society all the time in just one topic. Now it's Olympics and how this gay guy from UK is saying that he's proud and gay openly winning the Olympics. And next week, it will be another different thing. And we as a society usually focus on just one kind of things at a time. And that's really, really important because what leads us to legislative and social changes is what makes people believe that that is really important. And this is the most important thing during these timings, that this is something we are talking about all the day, all the night. We see it in media, we see in social media, we see in TV, everywhere. Okay, this is something radically important that even nowadays, the LGBT community is executing over and over again. Just realize that LGBT community is a community, a movement that assembles lots of different situations of aggressions and discriminations. They firstly talk about equal marriage for homosexual, and they talked and talked and talked about this till they got it. And then they've changed to, I don't know, for example, transsexuals mixed reality legalizations. And then they talk about no-binary people, and they all together support the different topic, the different solution from each part of their community in a way that they all focus on one point, they get it, and they do it much stronger and much deeper. If they had done that alone, both at the same time, they will have been firstly silencing each other because they will be fighting for the agenda setting. I will be fighting for the attention to each other because when people usually focus on one side, do not focus on the other, and sadly that's how we work. But they also will have been less strong because it's not only about that gay people will have to fight against the, I don't know, transsexual people for the age solution, but it's also about that the gay people has much more influence nowadays, sadly, than transsexual. So transsexual supports gay, and then gay can support transsexuals. I really believe that this is not only something more effective, but it's in fact something that makes us prioritize what is the most important and more urgent things for our society, what's the most urgent changes for our society. That makes us much effective and much more just in our development as a society. But before we go on, just closing opposition, sorry. Government.
So assuming that you acknowledge the fact that it's going to be a huge problem with agenda setting, and there's going to be some polarization within the movements of how to prioritize stuff, what is your solution on that?
I mean, I don't believe that we are assuming that we need agenda setting. I think that's quite a big reality nowadays. About the problems with how to decide which solutions there are and how do we decide which, how do we get into an agreement? I believe that was one of the opening opposition debates, and I was going right through them. Okay, so opening opposition said maybe that directly that different solutions are needed to each problem. And I think that that's obvious, and that's what happens with the LGBT community nowadays. However, we understand that different solutions are needed, and therefore we ask for these different solutions. The only difference here is that we are capable to coordinate and cooperate in order to get our solutions in a more effective and more just way, in a more prioritized order. Also, the problems with agreements, I believe, that are pretty non-comparative. Why? Because no agreements in certain topics are always going to happen. For example, inside feminism, nowadays feminism is just one collective, pretty determined, pretty closed to one objective. However, they disagree most of the things, like sex workers or like abortion or whatever. They generate different sides inside, and I believe that that's pretty non-comparative. Of course, social movement has this problem that people do not usually think alike in all the situations, but in the most important goals, in the most important objectives, they are going to be in an agreement, and therefore they are going to get the most important goals and agreement and solutions faster and in a more effective way. Secondly, that I want to keep talking is how unity identity impacts inside the collective. When you belong to a collective, you understand and develop the idea that an oppression and a discrimination is also an oppression and a discrimination to you, that something that is to your collective is something to yourself. Nowadays, me as a gay see racist violation as something horrible and problematic in my reality, but I do not feel that that's something that's aggravating and oppressing me, but just as an unjust. My level of engagement is much lower when I don't feel as a unity, as a collective with these people. And when it comes to a deadlocked situation, I have to prioritize. I usually prioritize, sadly, the things that affect me than the things that do not affect me. And I'm not going to be able to prioritize this because I'm not going to believe that I am part of that problem. Even further, when I see someone in the street that is being attacked, if I see that they are being attacked because of, I don't know, transsexual aggression, even if I'm gay, I'm going to be more likely to help them. Thank you so much.
We thank the speaker very much, and very happy to call on the deputy leader of the opposition here.
All right. I hope that I'm audible and that the
Yes, you are.
connection holds. Please write your POIs in the chat, and I will be starting in 3, 2, 1 now. All right, in response to opening government, I would just say you have not met your burden, because your burden is not to prove that why generally cooperation can be sometimes beneficial, but why every single movement that is in favor of oppressed groups, why every single one of them has to unite with every other single one of them. And that is what your burden is, and you simply did not live up to that. What you did prove, and what we agree with, is that sometimes when goals align, you should cooperate. That is something that happens in the status quo, and that is something that we think should continue to happen. But the problem that we have on opposition side is the all. It's this absolute idea that every single one has to cooperate with every single one. Because what are social movements like? Social movements have different goals, different interests. And what we recognize on opposition side is that oppression, that's what social movements fight against, oppression manifests in many different forms. And what we say is it cannot be boiled down to one cause behind which every single one of these movements can unite behind. Because social movements need to be able to make tactical compromises that advance their cause in order to advance the majority of the people, in order to achieve a beneficial outcome that helps their cause. And this all or nothing approach is harmful, because you might end up, or you probably will end up, sacrificing an improvement for most people because a very small or a probably small minority ends up not benefiting. And that's where the problem is. It is this loss of political capital that when it then comes to policy and influencing policy, because that's also what we need social movements for. What do we need social movements for? We need them to enact positive social change. We have social movements, for example, to thank for democracy, human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, etc., etc. And historically, social movements need to be as effective as possible in bringing about this change. And it's simply not effective, this all or nothing approach, because we have these very different goals. We have this opening government. You talked about this white woman, this white feminist. Like, let's say the goal of her social movement is that they want more female CEOs in large capitalist companies. But then you have workers, you have poor workers of color that are also women, that also say feminism, but they're like, well, feminism means that we have to fight capitalism as a whole. Now, I would love to try and see how these social movements would unite. The one wants a 50% women quota in CEO positions, and the other one wants to end capitalism. There is very little common ground there. And that is why we think it is simply not a good idea that then you would have these tactical deliberations within the movements, because you have to unite after all, that then the goal, that these very different goals sort of would be watered down to this minimal compromise, which might end up being what? Well, frankly, I do not know what the compromise is between having female CEOs and ending capitalism. But so in the end, you will lose people who do not feel represented or who feel disconnected. Because if you don't see that the social movement that you're a part of propagates your specific issues, then you might opt out altogether. You might even see yourself or see your movement defending and allying with people they see as outsiders or oppressors. Like I said, this poor working woman of color that suffers from capitalism. Suddenly her movement is fighting for this white woman to become a CEO. How ridiculous is that? Obviously, you're going to think that I will opt out. This is not what I'm in the fight for. So in the end, you have less people and less support, and therefore less progressive outcomes, because less people and less support means less directed pressure on policymakers, less direct pressure in the end on policy. And so in the end, you have less progressive outcome. This would also obviously mean that you will lose general support as well. You have to fight on more fronts at the same time, and fighting on more fronts at the same time, diverting your attention not from one cause, but on all causes, that limits your ability to effectively push for your goal. You must compromise with all the other groups. By definition, you have to support all others and fight together. And in status quo, when you don't agree, like even with the doctrine, you have to reach a common ground, because obviously you're going to have to unite. And that is something that is simply very, very ineffective, because there is this sort of zero-sum game of time and energy. There's only so much attention you get, only so much time that that policymakers will like lend an ear to you. And if you are a specific directed group, if you're a specific movement with a clear goal, then they can know who to approach if they want to advance something on the policy level there. Then you are the person that they, or you are the leader of the movements, are the ones that will be asked when it comes to in public discussions, in public discourse, etc., etc., etc. I will now be taking closing up. Government or up, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So surely though, fighting on the united front of being anti-oppression is more cohesive and easier to achieve change with than fighting on a bunch of different fronts.
Well, no, and that's exactly my point. And like I said, oppression manifests in very different views. The white woman might feel oppressed because she cannot, because she might feel, the glass ceiling and cannot become a CEO. But that is a very different form of oppression from what somebody who is being exploited by a first world country, if you work in a third world country. They might feel like ridicule is like, I am now the ally of the person, of the companies, because the woman wants to become CEO, and I am still being oppressed by the capitalist system and by the effects of colonization and imperialism. This is almost cynical. And we think that will ultimately end up hurting all of the causes. It will end up hurting all of the movements fighting oppression, because in the end, not a single goal will be able to be achieved. And if a goal actually does end up to be achieved, it will be one of such marginal benefit that in the end, it would probably be better if people continued to work side by side, align where your goals align, cooperate where you share the same interests, share the same goals. But obviously, you're not forced, or we believe that you should not be forced to unite with every single one, with every movement that fights oppression, because oppression manifests in different ways. The one group fighting oppression might be the oppressor of the other group fighting oppression. So we think that it's just much more sensible if you directly support your one cause that affects you directly, because you're more likely to put in and invest time and energy if you're directly linked to the thing that your movement is fighting for. We think that therefore government and opposition ends up proving that you would lose a tactical advantage in influencing policy if you do what government wants. We think that government loses the ones that are most harmed of oppression and those that they are offending, and the benefit in favor of marginal exposure. So we think that government in the end has less political capital and has less followership, because the goal ends up watering down. And that's why opening opposition wins this debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank the speaker very much, and very happy to call on the member of government here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. In the status quo, there are tens of disparate social movements all fighting for different things. In our world, everyone bands together in the solidarity and understanding that they are being oppressed, albeit in different ways. We get a female CEO who has her ideas overlooked in the boardroom, banding together with her Black cleaner who experiences racism every day. We get a movie star who's of an ethnic minority protesting against Hollywood So White, allying with indigenous communities who have their land stripped away from them. These people all vote in the same way. They share resources and funding. They speak up for each other on media and on social media so that all their goals can be achieved. This is a world we want to live in, and that's why we're incredibly proud to propose 2 things in my speech. First, how we get more political capital. Second, how we get a more efficient distribution of resources. Before that, opening up. The main argument they provide to us is you will lose certain supporters because it's impossible for lots of very different social movements to band together and fight for the same thing. Couple of responses. Firstly, if you identify as a feminist, for example, you're very unlikely to give up that identity. You might have posted about the Me Too movement on your Instagram. You might have retweeted something on Twitter. You tell people you're a feminist. You're very unlikely, just because you're told that you suddenly now have to support indigenous communities. You have to support refugee rights, that you decide to give up your feminist identity. This is also because of the endowment effect. If you believe that this is part of your identity and it's something you've lived with for a long time, you will swallow up certain pushes on your belief. So for example, if you're a right-wing feminist and you believe in reducing welfare, cutting off safety net for a lot of poorer individuals, but under social Marxism and feminist movements, you no that you will no longer be labeled as a feminist under this, you're more likely to change your views than completely leave the feminist movement. This is incredibly important, right? Because a lot of opposition's case hinges upon individuals' difference not being able to be reconciled if you don't support certain social movements. But we think it's much more likely that individuals who are empathetic, who already support certain social causes, are much more likely to continue supporting the thing they are supporting and also co-opt other problems that other people are suffering from. Second response, even if you lose certain individuals from the movement, so for example, TERFs who don't believe in trans rights and they stop becoming feminists, we actually think this is a good thing. We don't think you should be allowed to call yourself a feminist and only selectively advocate for women's rights, for privileged women's rights, and that's why we think in their best case scenario, we're happy to swallow that. Second, they tell us how it's inefficient to have a very large group fighting for different things. I'll address this directly in my speech. Firstly, why do we get more political capital? OG tells us how this fosters understanding, awareness, but all their arguments are just pro-intersectionality and don't actually have mechanisms for how they achieve change. I'll provide you 4 mechanisms for how we get more political capital for tangible change. Firstly, you're likely to be able to vote as a bloc. So this is somewhat similar to forming a coalition within the government and voting for certain policies, right? Individually, the movements are much less powerful if they just are very small swing voters voting for particular policies. But together, if they vote all at once, the votes can get policies passed, you can get leaders into power who support these movements. This means you're likely to push through certain policies like much more maternal leave. You're going to push through policies like, I don't know, better pay for women. You're likely to push through policies like stopping indigenous tribes from getting their land stripped away from them. So this is incredibly important, and you get a large group of voters on our side. Secondly, the sheer number of people who band together with this movement is likely to shift political parties and change their calculus, right? If it's a large bloc and an important group of voters, political parties are likely to, for example, shift leftwards so as to not alienate certain voters. They are able to see massive protests in the streets. They can see people online speaking up for each other. They just see a lot of people banding together. And note this is based on perception, right? Even if Op is right, and not all individuals do band together and vote together on every single issue, political parties and candidates still take this into account and don't want to risk alienating a certain group. The comparative on OP is that some individuals fighting for BLM might not have cared much about indigenous communities having their land destroyed, or the fact that climate change affects certain vulnerable groups who are living on the coast. This means that these minorities are often neglected or even scapegoated by politicians. For example, immigrants by right-wing parties. Or these individuals might not be on politicians' radar, whereas they are now, when there's a massive group of people fighting for smaller social movements that are part of this massive group of oppressed individuals. So now there are incentives for politicians to take note and care about them. Third mechanism, this shifts the over window. It makes it much more palatable to accept smaller incremental changes if now you have a massive group of individuals within a large movement fighting for a lot of quite different, quite radical policy changes, right? So for example, it becomes much more palatable to require all policemen to wear body cameras in the streets when you have a large group fighting for much more radical policies. Fourthly, this creates a united us versus them mentality for the groups of individuals banding together in a movement. Instead of, for example, Aboriginal individuals viewing privileged women as the oppressors, you now view each other as brothers and sisters who are all being oppressed on different scales and in different ways, but you form solidarity with them. This means you're much more likely to support them, you're much more likely to vote on behalf of them, and you get support and solidarity on an unprecedented scale. This is incredibly important. We get effective political change. Secondly, how do you get an efficient distribution of resources? Certain social movements get more funding and donations because of its nature. For example, the feminist Me Too Time's Up movement got support from Hollywood and a lot of successful and rich women. They also get a lot of press coverage, whereas social movements that fight for rights for refugees or immigrants get much less media attention and funding. What you get on our side is you get much more visibility. So for example, you get female Hollywood stars speaking up about Me Too and also talking about refugees' rights to work. You also get lots of other more privileged people in privileged positions being able to redistribute the resources from the feminist movement, for example, to indigenous communities who are fighting against government oppression. So this is important because of, for example, diminishing marginal utility, right? A little money goes a long way for smaller social movements who just need some money to, for example, fund strikes for working class individuals protesting against very low pay. It's important for advertisement and publicity. It's important to pay volunteers during protests. It's important for lobbying and getting politicians on your side. So this efficient redistribution of resources to poorer and smaller movements is incredibly important. We are so proud to propose.
We thank the speaker very much, and we're very happy to call on the member of opposition.
Perfect. Checking if I'm audible.
Yep.
Perfect. Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, one important piece of framing for this debate that for some reason the whole debate is ignoring. Most likely, this debate is not comparative for like movements that have already very similar goals. Why? Because they are already kind of propagating along with each other. So if we just talk about like the LGBTQ and the fem movement that tend to already kind of cooperate, the benefits that prop side brought you are marginal at best. The key here is about movements that have structural differences or movements that were overweight other ideologies that create this problem. So I think prop should have been a bit braver in this debate. I will tell you how this tactic will lead to the feeling of having less cohesion within the separate movements themselves and how this is going to harm their image and their representation. But before that, a bit of extraneous rebuttal. The main case that we hear from opening government is this idea that you are able to disconstruct privilege and understand the like problems that exist for other groups. We think if people are so like well understanding as we described, they already have the knowledge of how other people are harmed, of how other people are discriminated against. So they're not likely to be benefited that much by awareness by having a common goal because they kind of already know it. So we think that what happens most likely is that those people that have this understanding, yes, they do already kind of fight for different movements, but the difference is on the people that actually have beliefs that contradict each other. We think that when you do that, things become worse because you have huge tensions within like the movements themselves, because you feel like you are forced into taking a stand which you do not agree with. The reason why this is important is because like this idea of you being forced into a position to do something is exactly the thing that most of those people tend to fight against. The idea that women were forced to stay in the house, the idea that women were forced to have like their opinion devalued through the years, which means that in the end, what you have is reminding those people that they're disadvantaged. The idea that them being forced is something that their movement themselves kind of pushes towards them right now. Second of all, even if everything is perfect as described by prop side and people are happy and everything, we think that still this becomes worse for movements and causes that have like less important meanings, because like less important like in the eyes of the majority, as we can call it, because in the end, because they don't have so much support or so much capital, they tend to be undervalued, because what you get is you get like the big messages that everyone would agree on being represented, so you don't cause tensions and everyone is happy. So you lose out from the people that are more disproportionately affected because they have like those intersectional problems that already don't have enough voice, and you just kind of wipe them down even more. But let's take like closing government as well. What they tell us is that they're going to change like this idea of political capital. First idea that they have is that people are going to vote as a whole. We tell you that this is bad. Even if you have many people go to work like legislation or policy change, we think in order for them to agree, it is going to be so generic that it does not tackle the structural problems that are caused for these minorities. So we think that in the end, the policy that you're going to pass is going to be superficial and not necessarily solving the problems. But even if yes, we tell you like that policy is good, we'll tell you that still like movements have limited resources. So by focusing on those things, you tend to like lose your capital instead of like pushing for like radical change and kind of go like soft because you all kind of have to agree with each other. And then they tell us that somehow things are going to become and radical ideas are going to be pushed. Here, like contradiction. You can't have people agreeing on things and also the most radical ideas ideology is being represented, because if this happens, people are going to get mad because the radical ideology does not support what they believe. So that also tackles down their ideals of like feeling as one, because if you go to generic, you're too soft, so I'm not represented enough. And if you go to radical, I'm probably against you. So again, I'm not going to support the movement. But how does this look on the social movement? Like, we think that the goal of each social movement is to promote the nuances that these marginalized groups have and how they are represented. We think that their effectiveness is based on the cohesion within the separate movements. First thing that like this touches like this idea of the capital they have, both financial and political. So as I said, right now you spend too much of it into discussing things as how I'm going to agree with the rest of like the movement, which means that you have less time, less money, and less support in order to focus into changing your specific problems. That looks very bad, both for the people you are represented, because they don't feel so good like that they're put in the margin, but also for the society to take you seriously because you don't have so much time and energy to push for real change. Second of all, you take away from the moral duty that you have to act as a defense mechanism for those marginalized individuals. Because if you kind of water down their ideologies, if you kind of like water down what they're supposed to be doing, you don't help them as much in the problem that they have, which is not having enough voice or enough like pressure in order to push for those changes. Opening, I'll take it now.
Thank you. So proposition side is not like blending all of the movement together, but rather supporting the others that are not you. This means that movements that are minority also maintain their autonomy of deciding which policy and legislative interest they have.
Okay, the problem is if you're supporting each other and you want some type of change, you tend to have to focus on a specific message. You can't just like randomly put different ideas because it's not going to be effective. You're not going to support any change. So no impact from your side. I don't understand how just standing up and saying I support X, Y, and Z and trying to kind of solve it all together is going to be effective when you don't put like enough power in the specific message. We tell you that the most important thing you lose is the specific people that you get within this movement. So what are the most important stakeholders within the movement? Probably it is like the hardcore supporters, because those are the people that tend to like push for specific change, that tend to be a part of protests, that tend to be the ones that raise these huge social media campaigns. When you tell them that I'm not going to put enough emphasis on this moral value that I have as a movement, but kind of just support everyone all over the place, you tend to alienate them to an extent that they're not as willing to push for that movement. They tend to become either more radical, so create more tension around the movement, or just feel like that I shouldn't be supporting the movement itself, but I should just like try to do the best for myself. So in the end, what do we have? We have either people being forced to go into an ideology they don't really believe, make them ineffective in supporting that. We have radical people trying to be like, feeling like they're put in the margins. We have the cohesion of the movement harm as a whole. And for all those reasons, we beg you to vote with CO.
We thank the speaker very much, and we have to call on the government whip.
Hi. Part of me is slightly worried about my internet connection. So would it be okay if I kept my camera off while I was speaking?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just in case I don't want it to start glitching out. Can everyone hear me okay now, though?
Yes.
Okay. Amazing. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Great. Panel, I'm going to be doing 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to be going team by team and proving to you why what Sharon brought you from CG was necessarily the most weighty material in this debate and won us this round. Second, I'm going to be weighing up against OG and showing you why we contributed more substantial mechanizations and impacts to this debate. And finally, I'm going to assess some main themes. Naturally, 1, what gives social movements the best chance at success, either adhesion to social Marxism or not? And secondly, why our side of the house wins on this particular basis, right? So let's start with OO. They bring us four main things. First, they give us this claim that social movements exist in order to enact positive social change, right? And I think everyone in the debate agrees on this point, right? But they say that this is best done separately because these groups experience oppression differently. Note, however, that like the DLO said himself that tactical compromise is necessary to bring about this type of change. Thus, all of OG's material about minor differences within social movements is kind of mitigated on this basis. But even if we take them at their best, right, like this is untrue. Insofar as mass policy shifts for the reasons that Sharon tells you, such as the implementation of, general anti-discrimination legislation that help, a major cross-section of society from various social movements, is the result of precisely this type of collaboration, right? Now, CG says this type of impact is superficial. Note, however, we would say that in a country that is like by default conservative, as even if you get like fairly generic anti-discrimination legislation, that's certainly better than the alternative in like op world, where you don't get any of this at all because a conservative government is being bombarded by a variety of different social movements with a variety of like seemingly disparate demands, right? The social movements come together and they focus strictly on the abolition of oppression of marginalized people in general, right? Which is like that's what social Marxism is. It's the teaming up of like underrepresented, marginalized people in order to like fight for their liberation together. You get tangible change and it's more palatable by the masses, right? And like secondly, Sharon uniquely maps further on like why you actually get this change on our side, because of increased political capital, mutual solidarity, and the efficient distribution of resources, right? Now, like OO responds to this by saying social Marxism is just too overly complex. So all of this buy-in that we talk about is not possible because average people are less likely to engage with the movement. Two responses to this. Firstly, like it was just an assertion, like there's no analysis as to why this is the case, right? Like I don't think the general populace is like so stupid that they don't understand that social movements are pretty universally fighting for the liberation of some group of people, even if they don't understand the nuances of that like fight. But secondly, we would say that it's not a matter of like fighting on all fronts, right? It's fighting on a united front. So if anything, we would argue on CG that this means that you actually probably have more buy-in from everyday people because the theory is simplified. Panel, this is crucial. You don't have to get your average Joe to understand critical feminist theory and the history of the plight of indigenous populations around the world in order to explain the concept of oppression generally to them, right? When we have social movements unite together in order to fight against discrimination, we actually think that this is easier to understand for the majority of people. What does this mean? Like I said previously, you probably get more buy-in from politicians that otherwise wouldn't buy in because it seems like less edgy. But moreover, you get more buy-in from individuals that don't have time to or don't want to understand like complex social theories behind a bunch of social movements because they can at best or like at worst, at a minimum, understand that like oppression is probably something that we don't like. But third, right, they talk about how we lose a lot of marginalized voices to more dominant groups, right? Like i.e. white women speaking on racism. Firstly, again, unclear why this would happen, to the extent that like even within this like monolithic anti-oppression movement, like white working class men will probably want to speak about class. Seems reasonable to suggest that within the movement, people that are like the mouthpieces for those individual movements will want to speak about those movements. And I'm sure that like that would still happen anyway. But crucially, right, in any case, you probably have seemingly very different types of activists from different backgrounds in our side of the house, more likely to buy into social movements that they otherwise would not have, right? And Sharon impacts this when she talks to you about political will. It's like in my best interest as like a white working class male who wants to advocate for economic Marxism to back the interests of feminists if we're all working collectively together to push through bills that are going to benefit all of us, right? So necessarily it's unclear, or at least like opposition didn't mech why this would be the case, that this wouldn't happen. I'm sure I'll take a POI from opening. Okay.
Oppression is already deemed generally a bad thing. It's that social movements have to make it known that they are being oppressed, that certain groups experience oppression. There already is a general an anti-oppression block. It's just that you have to get people to know that you're being oppressed.
Yeah, exactly, which is why we're saying there's strength in numbers, right? So at the point at which you have mass rallies, where you have, someone that's a representative of BLM, where you have someone that's like a feminist, where you have someone that's an economic Marxist, all marching and speaking together, shouting, hey, we're being oppressed, that you're actually way more likely to have political buy-in and political will in order to enact the types of bills and policies that are going to alleviate all of you together from your oppression. It's exactly that type of visibility that you say that they need that we give you on our side of the house, right? Finally, they say that like people within these movements already love infighting, right? They're just like more likely to get more division. Note that like this was also an assertion from OO without substantiation, but like even if we take them at their best, right? It's probably not true. Sharon uniquely tells you that like being a racist feminist is an oxymoron, right? Like I don't think we have to defend on our side of the house these types of like individuals that claim to be social justice advocates on one side and then on the other side are horribly discriminatory, right? Like, but in any case, even if these people exist, they're not representative of the movements as a whole, right? Like this is particularly clear in feminism, where the fourth wave like clearly says intersectionality is fundamentally important, right? So I don't think that we have to defend that on our side of the house, right? I think crucially, like CO comes to us and they say, look, every movement's going to be watered down because there aren't enough like specific voices and there are limited resources. What we tell you on CG panel, and I think this is the most important material in the debate, right, is that it's in the interest of every social movement to be heard and to no longer face oppression. And insofar as they are dealing with oppression at large, and insofar as that is more easily digestible by the masses and by politicians, it necessarily benefits all social movements to show solidarity with one another. We uniquely mech this out on CG in a way that our OG doesn't. Sharon uniquely gives you 4 mechanisms as to why we get more change, more political capital, and more successful social movements on our side of the house, and further tells you why we uniquely benefit social movements that are significant but only affect a smaller subset of individuals, like indigenous populations. Insofar as we want social movements to succeed, and insofar as we think that we can deal with oppression more effectively on our side, CG.
We thank the speaker very much. And last but not least, very happy to come on the opposition with.
Great. Am I clearly audible? Nice. Give me 1 second, then I'll start. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. 3 framing actually is why CO is probably the only team that is comparative throughout this debate. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. Can I start over? Because I say a message that...
Yeah, you're cutting off a bit. Perhaps close down the camera.
No, wait. Give me a second.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Is it better?
Let's hope so.
Okay. If anything happens, feel free to interrupt me.
Okay.
Great. So I'm restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 pieces of framing that make this debate realistic for CO, and CO is probably the only team that is comparative to the marginal impact that this debate has. 1. We think that no social movement has this kind of capital and political influence when it comes to changing and like pushing for this progressive legislation that proposition side is trying to defend. We say not all people buy into the social movements. We say they have finite amount of resources, and if you want to actually make this kind of change, you need to take the trade-off that you're going to screw over smaller social movements in order to have the biggest capital and the biggest opportunity to make any kind of policy change. I don't think this is reasonable. Second of all, why more buy-in is not probably to happen inside proposition. Because people, what we're arguing in CO is the following. We don't think people have this kind of like tendency to follow the nuance and the new information that all social movements actually contribute when it comes to their political agenda. We say most of them are like disengaged, they're not entirely engaged when it comes to social movements, and they don't actually buy into to all the agendas and all the propositions that social movements are actually proposing. That is to say, if I'm following the environmentalist movement and I'm not entirely a feminist, I might see a nod when it comes to gender pay gap, but this does not mean that I will, like, with no critical thinking, follow this advertisement, and as an activist of the environmental movement, I will suddenly become someone who is a feminist, and then I'm going to be perfectly fine with changing my prioritization when it comes to the urgency of my social movement in order to give away some of my funds from my cause when it comes to like saving the gender pay gap. And this is the debate. This is where the debate is comparative. This debate is not about acknowledging different problems and different social movements. This debate is about sacrificing your prioritization and being okay by like giving out funds, campaigning and political capital in order to change other problems, in order to solve other problems. This is the burden that proposition has to defend, and they just like fiat that by saying, but everybody empathizes because everybody is actually oppressed, and therefore we're going to be okay by kicking out feminists, but they don't want to prioritize social movements. This is bad analysis. We need to take the trade-off of explaining why prioritization is something that's going to work out effectively, and is something that is going to change effectively something in the status quo, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following: structural barriers that push back like societal change still exist in the status quo. And the proposition side hasn't framed what actually shifts and what is the tipping point that you're actually going to be more probable of changing these structural barriers, right? So when it comes to gender pay gap, even if you manage to access all the resources, which is highly doubted, right? Like they are contingent on proving why most of the social movements, even the smaller ones like the indigenous people from Mexico, will give out 100% of their resources, or like 80% of their resources, in order to save feminist and gender pay gap. This is highly unlikely, and they are contingent on proving this efficiency. We're saying if you actually take that burden, we don't see what is the structural barriers you're going to change. So the best case scenario of proposition side is actually pushing forward for legislation in a superficial sense, in a marginal sense, because bias still exists in the status quo. Other incentives of politicians and like okay, let's say toxic masculinity still exists in the status quo. Cultural appropriation still exists in the status quo. Having more capital or having more buy-in, which is not proven by proposition side, is not something that is going to take away all of the problems, right? So the best case scenario is you catering the big like feminist movement or the big pollution movement, but simultaneously you take away the opportunity of other social movements having good representation. And this is where we're coming into our case. Why is that? One, we think this is about the small guy in this debate, right? So what we say is the following. We think the actual representation and the duty of each social movement is to find ways to portray and give 100% of its resources, its political capital to the people that actually been represented, because the movement is about you. Even if you don't achieve huge political change, being represented and being vocal about it, something extremely unique. If you take away this political capital and you just primarily focus to the proximate problems that are huge and need societal like radical change, then you lose out from this political sphere and this political opportunity to actually campaign for these problems, right? So we say the following: if if I'm from like a small village in Mexico and I want to be represented by my like social movement, I think this is highly unlikely to be in the same level, in the same percent, in the same representation when this exactly message is being watered down and is being alleviated by saying, oh, feminist is a more proximate problem and has bigger impact to women, therefore we need to prioritize that and we need to shift this agenda. And this is also contingent on my POI or on actually settling the agenda. The motion says unite and fight a common front. That is to say that you need to sit down with all the members, or let's say leaders of the social movements, and actually decide which problem is actually something that is more tangible and more like urgent to actually be saved. This is what Margelena comes up and says. You're going to probably lose out to the hardcore members exactly because they're not willing to make this trade-off. These people are people that have dedicated their lives on explaining to other people, on like giving up their jobs and giving up their funds, on actually like when it comes to feminist movement, helping out out women as much as possible. If they see their money or their political campaign given away to actually like addressing like pollution or like indigenous people in Amazon, they're not going to be okay with that. And this is something crucial because you're missing out on this representation and you're missing out on these dedicated people that have the necessity. This is going to create dispute and tensions that are unnecessary. This is why we're probably winning through proposition side. OG, go.
Thanks. Panel, Open are very engaged with the reality that even that the parts of the LGTB movement have different needs and different oppressions, the opposition problems do not happen. Why will it happen in their world when it's the same as LGBT movements, but in a bigger way?
Okay, you had your 50 seconds, sorry. What we're saying is the following. You have finite resources. You need to prioritize your own people. You need to dedicate yourself to this kind of cause. You have to provide an explanation on why this is going to be more efficient for all the movements. We weigh off you by explaining why smaller movements and qualitatively stacking up the smaller movements are going to be screwed over by your side of the house. We say the following. At the end of the day, we prioritize the quality of the representation, even if we don't have this big policy change that OGs and CGs contingent on. And this is what we're adding to OO, right? So we're not saying only, oh, you're not going to feel represented, but we give you structural analysis on why you're going to feel that the prioritization has shifted from the movement. You're losing capital and you're losing opportunity of the urgency of your movement. And this is why you're probably going to opt out from your movement. This is why we prefer having quality when it comes to individuals pushing forward for agenda and actually having more buy-in in their specific area, rather than actually boiling down and watering it down, losing the quality of this kind of representation. We have been proud to be organized at this debate. Please vote CO. Thank you.
We thank all speakers very, very much. Step outside, metaphorically shake hands, and we will call you in once we're done with the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who's Andrea?
I'm not entirely sure if there is of this room, but probably shouldn't have them here anyway.
Yeah, who is that Andrea? She's not right. She's not